What if the most influential financial dynasty in early modern Europe was not the one history remembers, but the one it quietly erased? What if before the Barclays, before the names that dominate textbooks and documentaries, there was a family operating in the shadows of empire building, shaping currencies, trade routes, and political influence long before banking became an institution? This is the kind of revelation that forces you to look at economic history through a completely different lens, because the rise of forgotten financial families is not random. It follows a pattern, a sequence of moves replicated across centuries, each one revealing how economic power is built, protected, and concealed. Imagine a period marked by fragile monarchies, volatile currencies, and rapidly expanding trade networks. In this environment, the ability to anticipate financial shocks was more valuable than gold itself. And some families mastered this game long before the world had a word for banker. They understood that influence was not achieved through visibility, but through positioning. They inserted themselves at the crossroads of commerce, supplying liquidity when kingdoms were collapsing, financing expeditions when states were bankrupt, and stabilizing currencies when markets were in freefall. This is where the hidden architecture of wealth accumulation begins, and where the roots of dynastic power quietly take shape. What becomes fascinating is not just how these families accumulated fortunes, but how they constructed financial ecosystems around themselves. Their strategies were not improvisations. They were deliberate, structured responses to geopolitical fractures. They used information asymmetry as leverage, transforming privileged access to trade flows, shipping intel, and early communication networks into economic dominance. It is impossible to understand the rise of later powerhouses, including the Barclays, without tracing the blueprint laid by those who came before them. And as you follow this thread, you start to realize the real question is not how a family gets rich, but how it becomes unavoidable. The deeper you go, the more you see the outlines of a hidden pattern repeating itself across centuries, inviting you to uncover what has been buried beneath official narratives. Before we move forward, tell me what this opening sparked for you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Tap the like button if this kind of historical deep dive matters to you, and make sure you're subscribed so you do not miss what comes next, because the unfolding of this story reveals far more than most people realize, and the next layer builds directly from here. To understand how this forgotten family rose to prominence, you have to step inside the economic landscape they inherited. Europe was undergoing a violent transformation. Empires were expanding faster than their financial systems could adapt. Monarchs were drowning in debt, and the flow of wealth was shifting from land to trade, from nobility to merchants, from visible power to those who controlled credit and information. In this world, stability was an illusion. Currencies fluctuated with every war, every treaty, every shipment lost at sea. And in the middle of that chaos, opportunity waited for anyone perceptive enough to recognize that influence could be built not by owning territory, but by financing those who did. What separated this family from the thousands of merchants competing? For relevance was their ability to interpret instability as a strategic advantage. They understood that early modern Europe wasn't defined by prosperity, but by volatility. Wars were constant, famine cyclical, governments unpredictable. Money, however, flowed through all of it. Whoever controlled the flow controlled outcomes, while others scrambled to protect their assets. This family positioned themselves to expand theirs. They offered credit when monarchs were desperate, stabilized currencies when treasuries collapsed, and funded trade routes that others deemed too risky. Each calculated move increased their leverage, turning them into indispensable actors long before their name appeared in any record. At the same time, they capitalized on the rise of maritime trade. Ports were becoming the new centers of wealth, and information from ships often arrived days before official reports. Those who accessed that information could anticipate shortages, price spikes, and political shifts. This family built networks inside these ports, gathering intelligence from sailors, merchants, insurers, and foreign agents. In a world where news could alter the fate of entire nations, their private information web became a powerful economic engine. This environment of uncertainty forged their strategy. Remain discreet, remain essential, remain ahead. While other families sought titles, recognition, or political offices, they pursued something far more valuable, something far more durable. They positioned themselves as the quiet architects behind financial decisions that shaped kingdoms. Their power grew not because they were seen, but because they were needed. And as their influence expanded, the economic order around them began to shift in ways that historians often attribute to broader forces, without acknowledging the hands operating behind the curtain, guiding the flow of credit, risk, and opportunity. What emerges is a portrait of a family who mastered the invisible. Mechanics of wealth long before the world understood how those mechanics worked, setting the stage for the strategic moves that would come next. Their rise was not the result of a single decisive moment, but there was a turning point, an early maneuver that transformed them from well-positioned merchants into a force that quietly reshaped financial power. It began with a crisis that devastated others, a currency failure triggered by a sequence of wars that drained royal treasuries across Europe. While most trading families panicked, pulling their capital out of circulation and retreating into defensive positions, this family recognized that the collapse of a currency was not an end, but a vacuum waiting to be filled. And whoever stepped into that vacuum first would dictate the terms of recovery. Instead of hoarding wealth, they deployed it strategically. They offered loans to governments at a moment when traditional lenders refused. They provided liquidity to traders stranded by unstable exchange rates. They established their own internal system of credit notes, which soon became trusted among merchants who needed stability in a world that no longer offered any. By doing what others feared, they created a parallel financial structure that operated independently of the collapsing monetary order. Slowly, their credit became more reliable than the crown's, their guarantees safer than official institutions, and their intelligence network more accurate than states. Messengers. Power shifted quietly toward the shadows, toward those who enabled commerce when governments could not. But the brilliance of this moment was not just in the risks they took, it was in how they leveraged information. They had early access to ship manifests, correspondence between diplomats, market reports from distant ports, and price movements from foreign exchanges. This wasn't luck, it was design. They built a system where knowledge arrived faster than anywhere else, and in the financial world of that era, being early was synonymous with being powerful. Knowing when a currency would break allowed them to exit before the collapse. Knowing when a kingdom needed money let them negotiate terms others could never dream of. Each transaction expanded their influence while deepening the dependence of others. Their first major fortune emerged during a famine-driven trade disruption. While grain prices surged and panic spread through cities, they controlled access to supply. Routes that few realized were still operational. They financed shipments others assumed impossible, using their intelligence network to bypass blockades and redirect fleets at the last possible moment. When the grain finally arrived, kingdoms stabilized, merchants survived, and political unrest eased, but all of it came through channels this family controlled. Their role was never mentioned publicly, yet behind closed doors, leaders acknowledged that without them the crisis might have swallowed entire regions. This episode wasn't merely commerce, it was the moment their influence crystallized into something more permanent. They understood that solving a crisis creates gratitude, but preventing a crisis creates dependency. And dependency, once built, rarely dissolves. Their strategic insight during this early turning point became the foundation for a dynasty whose influence would expand far beyond trade, shaping the architecture of financial power for generations to come. As their credit system expanded and their information network outpaced the communication channels of entire governments, the family began shaping the financial environment in ways far more subtle than issuing loans or stabilizing trade routes. They started influencing who could participate in commerce, which ventures could survive market volatility, and which political alliances had the resources to endure prolonged conflict. Their strategy was never to dominate openly, but to embed themselves so deeply into the economic fabric that removing them would unravel entire markets. Power, for them, was not a trophy. It was a position from which the world gradually oriented itself. Their expansion was silent because it did not rely on public institutions or royal appointments. Instead, it operated through webs of merchant partnerships, discrete agreements with port authorities, and long-term financing arrangements that bound influential traders to their network. They became the invisible hinge between regions that barely trusted each other, allowing goods, capital, and information to move with a reliability no state apparatus could provide. Bit by bit, their credit notes circulated more widely than the official currencies of some kingdoms, becoming a parallel medium of exchange, trusted by merchants who had grown tired of instability. What made their expansion so effective was their ability to respond faster than any government. When geopolitical tensions disrupted trade routes, they were already backing alternative paths. And when a monarch prepared for war, they had already assessed which factions would need funding and which commodities would spike in value. Their influence was a byproduct of preparation, foresight, and discipline. They didn't just predict shifts in economic power, they positioned themselves to benefit from them before they became visible to the world. Their reach extended into shipping companies, mining operations, textile production, and even early insurance schemes. They funded voyages that kingdoms refused to risk, supported merchants recovering from piracy losses, and stabilized commodity markets by controlling supply chains others didn't realize they owned. Through patience and precision, they created a network of interdependencies where countless actors, princes, shipowners, traders, and foreign envoys, found themselves reliant on the family's discretion and resources. And yet, their name rarely appeared in public record. Chroniclers wrote about kings and parliaments, generals and battles, but never about the financiers whose decisions controlled the flow of war chests, food supplies, and reconstruction funds. Their power existed in the shadows by design because anonymity offered what monarchies and empires could never provide: longevity. Families rise and fall in the public sphere, but those who operate behind it endure. As their influence deepened, the family transitioned from reacting to crises to shaping the conditions that made crises inevitable. Not through manipulation, but through an understanding that economic systems naturally bend toward those who anticipate their weaknesses. Their presence became structurally unavoidable, the quiet force that linked markets across continents, setting the stage for their next transformation into an institution that future banking dynasties, including the Barclays, would ultimately imitate, often without realizing the blueprint was centuries older. Now tell me, what part of this silent expansion fascinates you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments so we can dig deeper into the mechanics behind these hidden financial empires. As their network stretched across borders, their influence became woven into the geopolitical tensions shaping the world. Crises that seemed spontaneous or unavoidable often revealed themselves, upon closer inspection, to be deeply connected to financial imbalances the family had predicted long before they unfolded. Their operations had expanded beyond commerce itself. They were now involved in underwriting stability for entire regions. When currencies faltered, they provided the liquidity that prevented trade paralysis. When rival kingdoms prepared for conflict, they discreetly supported supply chains, ensuring that essential goods continued to move. And in moments when famine or disease threatened societal collapse, it was their capital that kept merchants afloat long enough for recovery to begin. This wasn't philanthropy. It was strategy. Every intervention established new dependencies. By solving immediate problems, they gained long-term leverage. The kingdom might recover from financial ruin, but the memory of who stabilized them and under what terms remained. And because no official documents recorded their involvement, their influence remained immune to political shifts, regime changes, or diplomatic upheaval. They became the only constant in a world defined by volatility. Their global connections also allowed them to recognize patterns other families missed. They knew which commodities would become scarce months before shortages hit. They understood how fluctuations in distant markets could trigger local instability. They saw how emerging technologies, like improved navigation tools or early industrial machinery, would reshape trade long before governments grasped the implications. This foresight allowed them to shift investments fluidly from one region to another, strengthening their position while competitors were still reacting to yesterday's events. One of their most significant advantages came from their integration into maritime trade. They financed fleets on both sides of political conflicts, a move that allowed them to maintain influence no matter which faction prevailed. Their ships carried goods essential for survival, from grain to timber to textile fibers, and their financial backing gave them priority access to ports in times of crisis. Even privateers and pirates operating on the fringes of legality often relied on intermediaries linked to the family for the sale or movement of seized cargo. In a world where power often came from controlling the seas, they effectively controlled the ecosystem surrounding it. Their presence extended even further when they began working closely with foreign envoys, diplomats, and agents. Many governments quietly used the family as intermediaries for discrete transactions they could not officially sanction: payments for intelligence, transfers of ransom funds, smuggling of critical materials, or financing of covert operations. Each favor cemented loyalty and ensured that their influence could reach places even kings could not. Yet the true brilliance of their rise was that they never appeared irreplaceable. Their strength lay in being indispensable while remaining unobtrusive. They understood that the greatest power is often the least visible, and that systems survive only when the architects remain in the background. Their connections, capital, and intelligence had grown into a global web, linking continents through relationships built over generations, not through force, but through trust, leverage, and necessity. And as their reach expanded, the world unknowingly stepped into a financial architecture shaped by their decisions, preparing the ground for the next phase of their transformation, one that would blur the line between private wealth and systemic power in ways that would echo for centuries. As their influence expanded across continents, the family began transitioning from opportunistic financiers into architects of an emerging economic order. Their wealth was no longer measured simply by silver reserves, trade fleets, or credit ledgers. It was measured by the systems that depended on them, systems they had helped construct through decades of strategic intervention. By this stage, their power was self-reinforcing. Markets moved because they moved. Political decisions shifted because their approval or their withdrawal carried consequences too large for monarchs to ignore. Their operations evolved from individual transactions into something far more sophisticated, a framework that governed risk, information, and liquidity across entire regions. They built structured partnerships with merchant guilds, shipping consortia, early insurance houses, and mining syndicates, weaving them into a network where each relied on the family's superior intelligence and credit stability. What appeared to outsiders as a natural evolution of commerce was, In reality, a carefully curated landscape shaped by the family's foresight. They understood that lasting power came not from dominance, but from creating an environment in which others could not function without them. This period marked the moment when their financial activity began blending into policy, even though they held no official political position. Kings sought their counsel not because they valued their opinion, but because their approval determined whether wars could be funded, alliances could be strengthened, or treasuries could remain solvent. Ambassadors approached them with proposals of trade expansion, territorial acquisitions, and diplomatic settlements, fully aware that without discreet financing, many of those ambitions would collapse before reaching the negotiating table. Their growing sophistication also appeared in their ability to shape markets indirectly. Instead of controlling commodities outright, they controlled the flow of information that determined how commodities were valued. Their agents reported shifts in demand months before governments realized them. Their partnerships in distant colonies allowed them to anticipate price shocks. Their involvement in early manufacturing centers gave them insight into technological improvements that would redefine labor and production. They didn't just profit from these developments, they positioned themselves to guide them. By consolidating influence in this way, the family created a structure where their decisions reverberated through multiple layers of the economy. A single adjustment in lending terms could alter shipping patterns, commodity prices, or diplomatic tensions. A shift in their risk tolerance could destabilize or revive entire markets. That level of systemic reach was unheard of in their era, yet it emerged so gradually that most contemporaries never recognized its origins. It was the beginning of what later generations would call institutional finance, though at the time it was simply seen as the inevitable result of expanding commerce. But the truth is far more deliberate than that. Their ascent into this role was not accidental. It was engineered. By remaining hidden, they avoided the political backlash that openly powerful families often faced. By staying indispensable, they avoided the instability that consumed kingdoms and empires. Their system was designed to outlive regimes, borders, and public memory, ensuring that their name faded even as their influence expanded. And as this consolidation solidified, a new dimension of their power began to emerge, one that extended beyond economics into the cultural and political realms that shaped entire eras, setting the stage for consequences far larger than financial gain. As their economic presence solidified into a structural force, the family's influence began to seep into realms that were never formally part of their enterprise. Power, once established through credit and commerce, naturally extended into culture, politics, and ideology, not through overt manipulation, but through the subtle gravitational pull that wealth and stability exerted over societies in flux. Kings, ministers, and diplomats increasingly depended not only on their financing, but on their judgment. Their correspondence was circulated through courts before treaties were drafted. Their assessments of market conditions informed decisions about warfare and taxation. Slowly, their perspective became a lens through which governments interpreted the world. This influence was not accidental. It emerged from their unique vantage point. They possessed information that no single ruler, no matter how powerful, could access. They understood economic interdependence before the concept had a name. They recognized that cultural movements shaped trade patterns, that religious tensions affected commodity flows, and that political unrest could be anticipated by monitoring credit strains. Their knowledge gave them predictive power, and predictive power gave them credibility. As a result, rulers quietly aligned policies with what the family's intelligence suggested, not because they were coerced, but because it was the safest path through uncertainty. Over time, the family began supporting cultural institutions, universities, guilds, and scholarly circles, not to seek prestige, but to shape the intellectual environment that influenced future leaders. They funded cartographers who mapped expanding trade routes, scholars who studied monetary history, and explorers who opened new markets. Ideas spread through these networks, and many of those ideas, unknowingly, reinforced the economic architecture the family had built. Education became an indirect tool of stability. Art and literature became channels for legitimizing trade expansion. Scientific discoveries quietly accelerated their influence. Politically, they operated with the same discipline they applied to finance. They avoided public alignment with any single faction, choosing instead to support continuity over ideology. They backed moderate voices who favored stable taxation, predictable trade laws, and balanced diplomacy. They did not attempt to control governments. They simply ensured governments did not make decisions that endangered the economic ecosystem they depended on. In doing so, they became an invisible moderating force, shaping eras without ever claiming credit. Their cultural influence was even more subtle. As their standards of accounting, risk evaluation, and commercial conduct spread, they set the norms that governed entire regions. Merchant families taught their sons to emulate the precision and discipline of this dynasty. Clerks copied their bookkeeping methods. Courts adopted their contractual structures. What began as private practice became public expectation, embedding their worldview into the foundations of economic life. Yet, despite all this reach, their anonymity persisted. Chroniclers mentioned merchants, guilds, and powerful financiers, but rarely this family by name. That silence was intentional. They understood that empires fall when they attract envy or fear. Their strength came from remaining the force behind the curtain, guiding events with a steady hand while leaving others to bear the weight of recognition. As their cultural and political influence deepened, the world around them transformed in ways that reflected their principles more than anyone realized. And this shift prepared the ground for the next stage of their evolution, a stage where their presence would shape not just markets or governments, but the very perception of economic reality itself. Before we continue, tell me, which aspect of this hidden influence strikes you the most? Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts so we can explore these deeper layers together. Despite their extraordinary reach, the family understood a fundamental truth that many powerful dynasties failed to grasp. Visibility is vulnerability. History is full of families who rose with brilliance only to collapse under the weight of political jealousy, public resentment, or sudden shifts in ideology. Empires turned against their own financiers. Monarchs seized assets from those who appeared too indispensable, and revolutions wiped out names that once seemed eternal. The family had no intention of becoming one of those casualties. Their most strategic decision, perhaps their most brilliant, was choosing when to step back from public prominence while retaining every thread of influence behind the scenes. Their withdrawal was not abrupt. It was gradual, calculated, and perfectly timed. At the height of their power, when their credit systems and intelligence networks had become foundational pillars of trade, they began transferring visible responsibilities to secondary partners, merchants, guild members, regional financiers, who acted as high-profile intermediaries. These figures appeared to the public as the new titans of commerce, while the family quietly continued controlling the mechanisms that made those successes possible. Influence shifted from direct ownership to structural leverage. By decentralizing their appearance while centralizing their control, they created a model that allowed them to disappear from the spotlight without losing anything. This strategic retreat coincided with a transformation in global finance. New families were rising, public banks were being chartered, joint stock companies were becoming political instruments, and colonial enterprises were gaining global recognition. The world seemed to be creating a new class of economic elites. And yet, many of these emerging powers were unknowingly building systems based on frameworks the family had designed generations earlier. Their credit models, their trade networks, their risk assessment structures, these became the skeleton of modern finance, adopted by institutions that believed they were innovating while actually inheriting an invisible blueprint. As these new financial dynasties gained fame, they also became shields. Public attention focused on the visible players, families whose names would later appear in textbooks, museums, corporate archives. These names absorbed both admiration and criticism, success and scandal. Meanwhile, the original architects operated from a position of near total anonymity. They transitioned into advisory roles, indirect ownership structures, and influence embedded within institutions rather than individuals. Their presence echoed through policy decisions, market behaviors, and institutional practices, even as their identity faded from collective memory. Decline, for them, was not failure, it was camouflage. They realized that the most resilient power is the kind that relies on being forgotten at the right moment. By allowing other families, like the ones history celebrates, including eventually the Barclays, to take the stage, they avoided the dangers that accompany recognition. Their wealth remained secure, their networks intact, and their perspective undisturbed by the turbulence that consumed highly visible elites. And so, while the world believed a new financial era had begun, the underlying structure remained shaped by minds that had simply stepped out of view. The family's disappearance from the historical foreground was not an ending, but a metamorphosis, one that preserved their reach while disguising their origins, setting the foundation for a legacy that would influence economic systems long after their name was no longer spoken. The transformation created a new paradox, a dynasty removed from history, yet woven into the core of institutions that would dominate the centuries ahead, preparing the ground for the final layers of their enduring impact. The legacy the family left behind did not take the form of monuments, written doctrines, or dynastic chronicles. Instead, it lived in the systems that outgrew them, structures so integrated into global finance that most people never question their origins. Their greatest contribution was not wealth accumulation, but the normalization of patterns that shaped how economies function, the movement of credit, the management of risk, the valuation of information, and the silent interplay between commerce and governance. These patterns became so embedded in the economic world that future generations assumed they were natural evolutions rather than carefully constructed frameworks. Modern banking practices trace their roots to mechanisms the family refined centuries earlier. The concept of dispersed risk was once a survival strategy in volatile markets. It later evolved into the foundation of sophisticated credit networks. The idea of maintaining influence through information flows became the blueprint for financial intelligence systems used by states and corporations. Even the principle of operating behind intermediaries anticipated the rise of institutional finance, where decision-making is often concealed behind layers of bureaucracy and complex ownership structures. The world adopted these innovations without realizing they were inheriting an invisible lineage. Their legacy also shaped geopolitical behavior. Governments today routinely rely on financial instruments to negotiate power, just as early monarchs once depended on the family's credit lines. Economic sanctions, currency, manipulation, and strategic investment flows mirror the family's early tactics for influencing political stability without direct involvement. The symbiotic relationship between markets and diplomacy, now taken for granted, originated from the same logic that guided their interventions centuries ago. Influence became a matter not of flags or armies, but of liquidity, access, and timing. Even cultural norms reflect their imprint. The expectation that commerce must operate predictably, that institutions must manage uncertainty, and that stability requires invisible guardians of financial order all echo the worldview they instilled. Their preference for anonymity foreshadowed the modern dynamic in which the most powerful economic actors are rarely the ones in the public eye. Today, global markets depend on entities and individuals whose identities remain unknown to the general population, much like the family who pioneered the structure long before the idea had a name. What makes their legacy so profound is its invisibility. Because their influence was never tied to public recognition, nothing about their decline, or rather their strategic withdrawal, interfered with the systems they left behind. The world continued operating on the rails they had laid. New families emerged, new empires rose and fell, new economic institutions claimed authority. Yet the underlying architecture remained eerily consistent with the structure the family had designed during their ascent. The modern financial world appears vastly more complex, yet at its core, it still follows patterns they established centuries earlier. Their impact persists not through memory, but through repetition. Every time markets react to information asymmetry, every time power shifts through financial leverage rather than force, every time wealth concentrates in ways that seem organic but follow historical precedent, the family's ghostly imprint surfaces. Their legacy is not a story of individuals, but of a system, one that has quietly shaped the world into its current form and continues guiding it, whether we acknowledge its origins or not. And it is within this continuity, this unbroken thread between past and present, that the final layer of their influence emerges. Understanding how these hidden foundations connect directly to modern financial powers, and how the echoes of their strategy still resonate in the global dynamics we navigate today. As the centuries progressed, the systems this family helped engineer became the operating code of global finance, inherited by institutions and dynasties that had no idea whose blueprint they were following. Families like the Barclays emerged into a world already structured by invisible predecessors. They flourished within frameworks of credit, risk, information flow, and discrete influence, frameworks shaped long before their rise. It was not that the Barclays replicated the earlier family's strategy intentionally, rather they succeeded, because they moved inside a structure designed to reward those who mastered liquidity, networks, and timing. The world had been built to favor those who understood that power no longer lived in palaces, but in ledgers, correspondence networks, and financial relationships that transcended borders. And this is where the connection to the present becomes most striking. Modern crises, currency shocks, banking failures, geopolitical tensions, follow patterns recognizable in the family's early maneuvers. Financial institutions today operate on principles that echo those old strategies, decentralizing visibility while centralizing control, leveraging information asymmetry, stabilizing markets while quietly dictating their conditions. Governments rely on financial mechanisms to navigate instability, just as monarchs once relied on the discrete power brokers behind them. The script is older than the names we celebrate, older than the institutions we recognize. It stretches across eras, carried forward by those who learned to read the currents beneath the surface rather than the waves above it. Understanding this lineage is not just a historical exercise, it reframes how we interpret influence today. The true architects of economic power often remain unnamed, operating through systems rather than personalities. The world remembers the public figures, the banks, the founders, the empires, but overlooks the hidden patterns that made their ascent possible. Seeing those patterns exposes the deeper reality. Financial power is cyclical, structural, and rooted in ideas that transcend generations. The Barclays were part of a chapter, not the beginning, And the forces shaping our current world are part of that same long continuum built on foundations we rarely stop to question. And now that you've reached this point in the story, it's worth reflecting on how these hidden dynamics shape the world you live in. If this journey helped you see economic history through a new lens, consider leaving a comment with the phrase, "I'm still with you," so I know you made it to the end of this chapter. And if the content brought clarity or sparked new questions, a like on the video helps this kind of work reach more people who care about understanding the invisible mechanisms shaping global power. If you want to keep exploring these deeper narratives and uncovering the forces operating behind modern events, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. There's a video here on the side that connects directly to the ideas we've explored. Click it and continue the journey with me.